What if freedom is not the road to happiness but the gateway to suffering? What if self-awareness, rather than enlightening us, leads to self-destruction? In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky presents a character who embodies these questions in their most unsettling form, the underground man. A figure consumed by contradictions, he is both highly intelligent and utterly irrational, fiercely independent yet hopelessly isolated, self-loathing but insistent on his own superiority. His confessions are not just the bitter ramblings of a misanthrope. They are a profound exploration of the human psyche, exposing the darker impulses that govern even the most enlightened minds. This nameless narrator has been called literature's first existential anti-hero, a prototype of the modern man plagued by self-doubt, alienation, and an almost pathological resistance to the very idea of happiness. Through his chaotic monologue, Dostoevsky lays bare the deep fractures in human nature, the refusal to conform, the craving for meaning, and the perverse delight found in suffering. The underground man does not merely exist in the pages of a novel. He is an idea, a mirror reflecting the hidden turmoil within us all. But who was the man behind this creation, and what led him to such a grim vision of the human condition? Few writers have lived through transformations as radical as Fyodor Dostoevsky. His early years were marked by literary success, but his life took a dramatic turn when he was arrested for involvement in a radical intellectual circle. Sentenced to death, he stood before a firing squad, only to be spared at the last moment when a messenger arrived with a last-minute reprieve from the Tsar. The experience shattered him. The naive political idealist who had once believed in progress and reason was reborn as a man who had glimpsed the void. His years in a Siberian labor camp exposed him to the full spectrum of human nature: brutality, resilience, cruelty, and compassion. He witnessed how suffering could break men, but also how it could transform them. This experience forged his belief that suffering was not merely an obstacle to be overcome, but an integral part of the human experience. Unlike the utopians of his time, who sought to construct a perfect society free from pain and struggle, Dostoevsky came to see such aspirations as profoundly misguided. By the time he wrote Notes from Underground, he had already begun his philosophical battle against the rising tide of rationalism, nihilism, and socialism. He saw these ideologies as dangerously naive, based on the assumption that human beings were fundamentally logical, predictable, and capable of being shaped into ideal citizens through the right social conditions. The underground man serves as a direct refutation of these ideas, a character who demonstrates through his own self-destruction that man is far more complex, irrational, and driven by forces beyond reason. With this understanding of Dostoevsky's background, we can now delve deeper into the world of the underground man, a place where logic is powerless, free will is a burden, and suffering is not just unavoidable, but inescapable. By the mid-19th century, a radical shift in thought was sweeping through Russia. Traditional values, faith, morality, and societal hierarchies were beginning to erode under the weight of a new intellectual movement, nihilism. In contrast to mere skepticism, which questions but does not necessarily reject, nihilism was an outright dismissal of all inherited beliefs. It was the assertion that nothing, no authority, no institution, no tradition, deserved unquestioning reverence. This ideology found its most famous early expression in Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, 1862, which introduced Russian readers to the character of Bazarov, a young nihilist who embodies the movement's principles. For him, reason alone should dictate action. All that cannot be measured, logically justified, or scientifically proven is irrelevant. Anything sentimental, mystical, or idealistic is nothing more than a relic of an outdated worldview. At first, nihilism might appear liberating, a defiant break from oppressive dogma. But Dostoevsky saw something far more dangerous lurking beneath its surface. The total rejection of inherited meaning did not lead to greater wisdom or enlightenment. It created a void, one that could easily be filled by despair, radicalism, or destructive impulses. He understood that when people no longer believe in something greater than themselves, they risk spiraling into apathy, resentment, or violence. Notes from Underground would be his first great warning against this descent into meaninglessness. One of the key intellectual currents fueling nihilism was the belief in rational egoism, the idea that human behavior could be entirely explained and even optimized through self-interest and reason. This concept, which had parallels in utilitarian philosophy, suggested that people, when properly educated, would always act in ways that maximize their own benefit, leading to a more harmonious and efficient society. Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, even devised a mathematical formula, the hedonic calculus, to quantify pleasure and pain, believing that human choices could be reduced to predictable calculations. This belief in the supremacy of rational self-interest was embraced by many radical thinkers of Dostoevsky's time, including Nikolai Chernyshevsky, whose novel What Is to Be Done, 1863, presented a vision of a utopian future where enlightened individuals, driven purely by logic and self-interest, would create a perfect society. To Dostoevsky, this vision was not just naive, it was profoundly dehumanizing. He understood that people do not always act rationally, that emotions, impulses, and contradictions govern much of human behavior. The underground man exists in direct opposition to the ideal of the rational, self-maximizing individual. He deliberately acts against his own interests, knowingly undermines his own well-being, and takes a perverse pleasure in suffering. His existence is proof that human nature cannot be reduced to a series of predictable calculations. His biting remark, "I say let the world go to hell, but I should always have my tea," captures the paradox of rational egoism. A world built on pure self-interest inevitably leads to moral indifference, where people justify inaction or even cruelty simply because it does not directly affect them. Dostoevsky saw this as the foundation for an increasingly fractured and selfish society, one where moral responsibility would be abandoned in favor of personal convenience. If rational egoism provided the intellectual justification for self-interest, socialist utopianism offered a grander, more seductive promise, a future where all suffering, inequality, and conflict would be eradicated. The most famous expression of this dream was Chernyshevsky's vision of the Crystal Palace, a metaphor for a perfectly structured society where all human needs would be met through scientific and rational organization. In this utopia, there would be no crime, no injustice, no unnecessary suffering, only progress and prosperity. It was a vision that would later inspire socialist and communist movements across the world, promising that with the right economic and political structures, the flaws of human nature could be engineered away. But Dostoevsky saw a fatal flaw in this vision. The underground man rejects the Crystal Palace not because he does not want comfort or security, but because he recognizes that such a world would be profoundly inhuman. If everything is predetermined, if all desires are accounted for and all actions dictated by reason, then what is left of free will? If suffering is eradicated, then what meaning can joy possibly have? Dostoevsky's warning is chillingly clear. A world that prioritizes order and rationality above all else risks crushing the very essence of what makes us human. His rejection of utopian fantasies is summed up in one of his most memorable lines. "I rejected the Crystal Palace myself for the sole reason that one would not be allowed to stick out one's tongue at it." For Dostoevsky, the need to rebel, to affirm one's own will, even at the cost of suffering, is fundamental to the human experience. He understood that no matter how perfect a system appears on paper, it can never account for the irrational, unpredictable, and often self-destructive nature of man. As history would later prove, attempts to create rationally engineered utopias often led not to paradise but to oppression, suffering, and violence. Notes from Underground serves as a prophetic critique of this impulse, exposing the inherent dangers of trying to force human nature into a rigid, mathematical framework. With the foundations of nihilism and rationalism established, we are now ready to enter the mind of the underground man himself, a man who embodies the consequences of rejecting all external meaning, yet finds no solace in the freedom he has claimed. At the core of Notes from Underground lies a character unlike any other in literature, a man who exists in contradiction, who simultaneously desires and rejects, who resents the world but refuses to leave his self-imposed isolation. He is nameless yet unforgettable. The underground man is not just a character, but a study of the human psyche pushed to its most extreme form of self-awareness. His introduction is both unsettling and revealing. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. These confessions, delivered with an almost theatrical bitterness, immediately establish his defining trait, an obsessive preoccupation with his own condition. He is fully aware of his flaws but refuses to change them. He describes his sickness not as a physical ailment, but as a deeper, more corrosive disease, one of excessive consciousness. Unlike the classical tragic hero who suffers due to external circumstances or fate, the underground man inflicts suffering upon himself. He thrives on self-sabotage, constructing elaborate justifications for his failures and indulging in cycles of resentment and regret. He rejects society, yet desperately craves its recognition. He despises others, but his loneliness is unbearable. His life is an endless internal monologue, a relentless examination of his own contradictions. There is no room for action, no possibility of escape. He remains trapped in a prison of his own making, constantly tearing himself apart with thoughts that lead nowhere. Dostoevsky contrasts the underground man with what he calls the man of action, the individual who moves through life decisively, without the burden of excessive self-reflection. This man does not agonize over his choices. He acts. He believes in his own agency, follows the rules of society, and does not question the meaning of his existence. The underground man, by contrast, is paralyzed by his own mind. He analyzes every possible decision from every possible angle, until all options appear equally meaningless. He despises the man of action for his simplicity, yet he envies him for his ability to live without doubt. Dostoevsky encapsulates this existential torment in a chilling phrase: "To think too much is a disease. The more one examines oneself, the less certain one becomes. The more one questions the world, the more absurd it appears." The underground man is not just a victim of his intelligence, he is enslaved by it. His hyper-awareness does not grant him insight or wisdom, but only an unbearable knowledge of his own powerlessness. This is one of Dostoevsky's most profound insights, that excessive self-consciousness can be just as crippling as blind ignorance. The more the underground man reflects, the further he drifts from any tangible reality, sinking deeper into self-doubt, self-loathing, and inertia. One of the underground man's most powerful metaphors is the stone wall, a symbol of absolute, inescapable reality. The rationalist thinkers of his time, influenced by scientific determinism, believed that all aspects of life could be explained through reason and natural laws. In their worldview, human behavior was no different from the movements of the stars or the laws of physics. Everything was predictable, logical, and ultimately reducible to formulae. But the underground man refuses to accept this. He is aware that reality has limits, that there are barriers which no individual can overcome, yet he rejects the idea that he must submit to them. He describes the man of action as someone who, when confronted with a stone wall, simply stops and accepts it as an unchangeable fact. The underground man, however, cannot accept this passively. He rages against the wall not because he believes he can break through it, but because surrendering to it would mean abandoning his sense of self. Even when he knows his resistance is futile, he continues to struggle, an act of rebellion purely for its own sake. This is where Dostoevsky brilliantly deconstructs the illusion of rationality. The belief that human beings will always act according to logical self-interest ignores a fundamental truth. People will often act against their own well-being, if only to prove that they can. The underground man illustrates this perfectly when he challenges the most basic axiom of logic. 2 times 2 equals 4? Very well, but what if I want 2 times 2 to equal 5? This is not mere irrationality. It is a declaration of freedom. He understands that pure logic dictates the world, but he refuses to accept that his own desires and will must be subordinate to it. His rebellion is not aimed at achieving victory, but at proving that he still has the power to defy, even if only in principle. What makes the underground man such a compelling character is that his suffering is entirely self-imposed. He is not trapped by society, nor by fate, nor by external oppression. His prison is internal, his mind, his thoughts, his refusal to engage with the world in any meaningful way. Dostoevsky presents him as both a warning and a mirror. He embodies the dangers of extreme introspection, the paralysis of endless self-analysis, the despair that comes from rejecting all external meaning, yet failing to create one's own. He is what happens when a man becomes so detached from reality that even his own suffering becomes a source of twisted satisfaction. With the underground man fully introduced, we now turn to an even deeper question. Why does he embrace suffering? Why does he find pleasure in pain? And what does this reveal about the nature of human psychology? For centuries, philosophers and social theorists have assumed that human beings act according to reason, that our decisions are guided by logic and the pursuit of self-interest. The underground man dismantles this assumption entirely. He does not seek happiness, nor does he pursue what is best for him. Quite the opposite. He sabotages his own life at every opportunity, consciously choosing paths that lead to suffering, simply to assert his own will. He states this outright. Man will even desire what is injurious to him, simply to have the right to desire for himself. This statement strikes at the heart of what makes the underground man such an unsettling figure. He embraces destruction as an act of defiance. Rationalists argue that human behavior can be predicted through incentives, that people will always choose the option that maximizes their benefit. But Dostoevsky argues otherwise. If people are told that they must act in a certain way because it is logical, they will rebel just to prove they are not mere machines. This is a key critique of utopian ideologies that assume people will conform to perfect systems of order. The underground man represents a force that refuses to be tamed. Even when presented with a world where all suffering is eliminated, he would still find a reason to suffer. He embodies the deep and chaotic impulses of human nature that defy rational explanations. Dostoevsky suggests that the desire to rebel is more fundamental than the desire for well-being. The underground man does not merely oppose external authorities. He rebels against the very notion that his actions should be dictated by reason. At first glance, the idea of finding pleasure in suffering seems absurd. Pain, after all, is something we are biologically programmed to avoid. And yet, the underground man not only endures suffering, he delights in it. He confesses this explicitly in a bizarre example. I felt a sort of secret, abnormal, contemptible delight when, on coming home on one of the fellest nights in Petersburg, I used to realize intensely that again, I'd been guilty of some dastardly action that day. And inwardly, secretly, I used to go nagging myself, worrying myself, accusing myself, till at last the bitterness I felt turned into a sort of shameful, damnable sweetness, and finally, into real positive delight. Yes, into delight. This is not just masochism. It is a deliberate indulgence in self-inflicted suffering. He takes joy in his own degradation. Why? Because it is his suffering. No one else imposed it upon him. No external force dictated it. He chose it. And in that choice, he finds control. This is a deeply unsettling idea, but one that explains much about human psychology. People often cling to their own misery, even when escape is possible, because it gives them a sense of ownership over their pain. The underground man does not seek relief. He seeks to define himself through his suffering. Dostoevsky extends this theme with an almost comedic metaphor: the pain of a toothache. The underground man describes how a person suffering from a severe toothache will moan loudly, not just out of pain but out of sheer spite, to make sure everyone else around them hears it. He does not simply endure the pain. He turns it into a weapon against others. His suffering becomes a performance, an act of vengeance against a world that refuses to acknowledge his existence. He relishes in the discomfort he causes, feeding off the irritation of those around him. This sadistic pleasure in causing misery both to himself and others, is a defining trait of his character. It reveals an unsettling truth. Suffering is not just something we experience passively. It is something we can wield, manipulate, and even cultivate. At the core of Notes from Underground is an argument against utopian visions of society. Rationalists of Dostoevsky's time believed that, with enough progress, suffering could be eliminated, that the world could be structured in such a way that humans would no longer need to struggle. The underground man finds this idea revolting. He argues that no matter how perfect the world becomes, people will always find ways to introduce chaos. Why? Because a life devoid of suffering is a life devoid of meaning. He directly challenges the assumption that human beings want only comfort and happiness. He writes, "Which is better, cheap happiness or sublime suffering?" This is not merely rhetorical. Dostoevsky suggests that humans crave a sense of struggle, a reason to fight against something, even if that something is themselves. Without hardship, without obstacles, life becomes dull, mechanical, a mere existence rather than a true experience. The underground man rejects utopia because it strips away the very thing that makes life worth living, the ability to make choices, even bad ones. This is why he states with absolute defiance, "A man needs freedom as much as he needs air." But what happens when that freedom is taken too far? What if rebellion itself becomes self-destructive? In the next section, we will explore how the underground man's philosophy leads to complete isolation, and how, despite everything, he remains trapped in a cycle he cannot escape. Dostoevsky was not merely writing about an isolated figure in Notes from Underground. He was warning us about a broader pattern in human history. The underground man is a symptom, not an anomaly. His mindset, his rebellion against structure, and his deep dissatisfaction with existence are all reflections of larger societal trends. This novel, written in the 1860s, eerily foreshadowed the great ideological experiments of the 20th century. The utopian fantasies that Dostoevsky ridiculed in his time, especially the idea that rational organization could perfect human society, became horrifying realities in the form of totalitarian regimes. Stalinism, Maoism, fascism, and other radical movements all shared one fundamental belief: that human nature could be reshaped. They sought to engineer society, eliminating disorder, suffering, and unpredictability. Just as the rationalist thinkers of Dostoevsky's time proposed that people could be programmed to act in their own best interests, 20th century ideologies attempted to implement this logic on a mass scale. The underground man, however, had already exposed the fatal flaw in this idea. He knew that humans are not machines, that they will not simply submit to structures imposed on them. Man is not a programmable being. He is chaotic, contradictory, and capable of destruction simply for its own sake. His famous declaration, "Man is not a piano key," is a direct challenge to any system that tries to mechanize human nature. The notion that suffering could be eradicated through reason was not just naive, it was dangerous. The attempt to eliminate suffering led to something far worse: a complete loss of individuality, and with it, a justification for mass oppression. History proved Dostoevsky right. The very systems that sought to remove suffering ended up inflicting more suffering than the world had ever seen. We might be tempted to think that these lessons belong to the past, that we have learned from history, and will not repeat its mistakes. But Dostoevsky's warning remains as relevant as ever. Today we see new utopian visions taking hold. This time, not necessarily in the form of political regimes, but through technology, ideology, and social engineering. There is a growing belief that with enough data, surveillance, and behavioral conditioning, human beings can be guided into perfect rationality. Whether it's the optimization of human behavior through algorithms, the elimination of suffering through pharmaceuticals, or the attempt to create social harmony by controlling speech and thought, we are once again falling into the trap of believing that human nature can be neatly controlled. But the underground man reminds us that people will always resist control, no matter how benevolent its intentions. The more we try to force human beings into a state of engineered perfection, the more they will rebel. sometimes in ways that are irrational, self-destructive, or even violent. This is not an argument against progress, nor is it an endorsement of chaos. Rather, it is a warning against the illusion that we can eliminate suffering without also eliminating freedom. Dostoevsky understood a truth that modern society often forgets. Suffering is not a problem to be eradicated, but a fundamental part of what makes us human. Attempts to eliminate it entirely will only lead to deeper forms of oppression and alienation. At its core, Notes from Underground presents us with a fundamental dilemma. Is it better to have absolute security or to be free, even if that freedom comes with suffering? The underground man's answer is clear. He rejects the comfort of a well-ordered life. He chooses suffering because, in his eyes, it is the price of true autonomy. But what about us? In a world that increasingly seeks to remove uncertainty, disorder, and discomfort, are we willing to pay the price of true freedom? Or will we, in the end, trade our autonomy for comfort and predictability? As Dostoevsky asks through the voice of the underground man, hadn't we better kick over the whole show and scatter rationalism to the winds, simply to enable us to live once more at our own sweet, foolish will? It is a question that remains as urgent today as it was in Dostoevsky's time. And the way we answer it will determine the future of our civilization. As we conclude our exploration of Notes from Underground, one question lingers. What does the underground man reveal about us? It would be easy to dismiss him as a literary anomaly, a bitter, self-destructive recluse whose experiences bear little relevance to the modern world. But that would be a mistake. The underground man is not an isolated figure. He is a reflection of a universal struggle within the human psyche. His contradictions, his rebellion against meaning, his resistance to order, these are not just the ravings of a single man. They are the symptoms of a broader existential dilemma that has haunted humanity for centuries. Are we seeking happiness, or are we seeking control? Do we want freedom, or do we want security? These are the questions Dostoevsky forces us to confront, and they remain just as relevant today as they were in 1864. In a world obsessed with optimization, efficiency, and predictability, the underground man reminds us of something uncomfortable. We are not rational beings. We are creatures of paradox, driven by conflicting desires torn between reason and emotion, between logic and chaos. We crave meaning, yet we often reject the structures that provide it. We demand autonomy, yet we long for guidance. We resent suffering, yet we find ways to create it. And so, the underground man is not an artifact of the past. He is alive in the 21st century, hidden beneath layers of social conditioning, restrained by cultural norms, but still whispering his doubts into the back of our minds. If there is one central lesson to be drawn from Notes from Underground, it is this: true freedom is costly. It comes with uncertainty, with suffering, with the weight of responsibility. Dostoevsky understood that the price of a world without suffering is the loss of individuality. The more we attempt to construct a society where suffering is eliminated, where every action is dictated by reason, where human impulses are controlled, where unpredictability is removed, the more we risk erasing what makes life meaningful. This is why utopian visions, no matter how well intended, always contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. They misunderstand a fundamental truth. Man does not want to be reduced to a predictable, rational being. The underground man rejects utopia, not because he wishes for suffering, but because he knows that without struggle, there is no true existence. He chooses the uncertainty of life over the sterility of absolute order. And in doing so, he forces us to ask ourselves, what do we value more, comfort or authenticity? Stability or self-determination? A life free from suffering or a life that is genuinely our own? These questions are not merely philosophical. They are the foundation of every political, social, and cultural system we create. The balance between freedom and control is at the heart of civilization itself. As we look around at the world today, it is clear that Dostoevsky's warnings have not lost their relevance. We still chase impossible utopias, still believe that the right ideology, the right technology, or the right policies can perfect society. But the underground man reminds us that perfection is an illusion, and that the pursuit of it often leads to the very destruction we sought to avoid. So the final question is not about him, it is about us. Are we still searching for a crystal palace? And if so, what are we willing to sacrifice to build it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you see echoes of the underground man in the modern world? Do you believe we are still chasing impossible ideals? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Dostoevsky, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more explorations of philosophy, psychology, and literature. Dostoevsky looked into the abyss and wrote what he saw. The real question is, will we listen?